The National Policy Forum was buzzing with anticipation. It wasn't every day that political figures from opposing ideologies sat on the same stage to discuss leadership, civility, and public trust. Amid the high-profile guests and carefully worded speeches, one name kept surfacing in quiet conversations: Jasmine Crockett. Known for her fierce personality and uncompromising voice in Congress, she had become a lightning rod for both praise and criticism. But on this particular morning, it wasn't her words that sparked attention, it was what Ivanka Trump had to say. Ivanka, poised and collected as always, had been invited to speak about political leadership in modern America. Though she wasn't an elected official, her role as a senior advisor to her father and her continuing influence in conservative circles made her a key voice in discussions about decorum and responsibility in government. When it came time for her to speak, the audience leaned in, not because they expected fireworks, but because they knew Ivanka had a way of making subtle critiques that could sting far more than shouting matches. As she took her place on stage, the moderator asked a general question about leadership styles and emotional control in public office. Ivanka adjusted her microphone and began to speak calmly. I think we need to stop pretending that leadership is just about having the right policies or saying the right things. She began. It's also about how you carry yourself, especially under pressure, and when people watch our elected officials losing control, shouting, or engaging in personal attacks, it undermines the credibility of everything they say. No one was named yet, but the tone had shifted. Then she continued. I don't want to single anyone out unfairly, she said, pausing for a second as if considering whether to continue. But I think recent events in the House have raised real questions. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, for instance, has had multiple moments that, frankly, have made headlines for all the wrong reasons. Passion is one thing, people respect conviction. But when it crosses the line into mockery or emotional outbursts, it becomes a distraction. A quiet murmur moved through the room. This was no longer just commentary on leadership in theory. It was pointed, and everyone knew it. Ivanka didn't raise her voice. She didn't attack in a personal or crude way. That wasn't her style, but she made her position clear. Jasmine Crockett, in her view, had shown behavior that called her fitness for leadership into question. Voters want strength, but they also want stability, Ivanka said. They want someone who can advocate without alienating. Someone who can respond with substance, not just volume. The timing of her remarks was intentional. Just a week earlier, video clips of Crockett clashing with colleagues during a heated committee hearing had gone viral. In the clip, Crockett could be seen raising her voice and trading biting sarcasm with members across the aisle. Supporters called it a bold stand against hypocrisy. Critics labeled it a meltdown. Ivanka, it seemed, leaned toward the latter interpretation. I'm not here to lecture anyone, she added. But I do think it's fair to ask, are we rewarding behavior that builds trust or erodes it? That was the moment the air seemed to thicken. Cameras panned to Crockett, who sat calmly at the opposite end of the stage. She didn't flinch, she didn't react. If anything, she looked almost amused, like someone who had been expecting this moment all along. But the statement had been made. In a room full of journalists, academics, and policymakers, Ivanka Trump had done what few others dared to do in such a public forum: question a sitting member of Congress's composure and, by implication, her ability to lead. It wasn't a viral clip or a social media jab. It was a carefully measured judgment made in a room full of power players. And it landed with precision. The comment would ripple far beyond that stage. Within minutes, the quote began trending online. Supporters of Ivanka praised her for speaking plainly about behavior they saw as unbecoming of elected officials. Critics accused her of tone policing and deflecting from more serious issues. But, no matter which side one stood on, the message was clear. Ivanka Trump had called Jasmine Crockett unfit, and the political world was watching closely to see how Crockett would respond. As the room digested Ivanka Trump's pointed remarks about Jasmine Crockett's temperament, all eyes naturally shifted to the Congresswoman. There was an air of expectation, a familiar anticipation that Crockett would leap to her own defense, with the same fire that had both electrified and divided her supporters. But Jasmine didn't lean forward, didn't tighten her jaw, and didn't show the hint of outrage people were waiting for. Instead, she offered a small, measured smile. When the moderator gently turned the floor over to her, Crockett reached for her water glass, took a slow sip, and calmly adjusted her mic. The contrast was striking. Where people expected heat, she brought ice. Her voice was steady, even warm. She didn't start with a rebuttal. She started with a confession. I want to thank Ms. Trump for sharing her perspective, she said, glancing briefly in Ivanka's direction. I don't take being called unfit lightly. That's a serious word. But I also don't take it personally. That sentence drew murmurs from the crowd, as if people were surprised she hadn't immediately pushed back. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Truth is, we all come into this arena with different experiences, different styles, and different expectations placed on us. I didn't grow up with the same playbook or the same privileges. I didn't inherit calm boardrooms or get taught how to speak in rooms that always respected me. I came from communities where speaking softly didn't get you heard, where silence could cost lives. Asterisk, a subtle silence fell over the room. This wasn't the angry response anyone anticipated. It was personal, grounded, and real. Asterisk, I understand why my style makes some people uncomfortable, she continued. But before we judge the style, we ought to examine the system that demands it. Asterisk, Ivanka appeared thoughtful, even slightly unsettled. This wasn't going the way she or anyone else thought it would. Crockett then shifted gears. Asterisk, since we're talking about leadership and fitness, I want to bring something into this conversation, something I wasn't planning to share today, but I believe in transparency. I have nothing to hide. And frankly, if we're going to talk about my reactions, I'd like to share a bit of what's behind them. Asterisk, she reached down, opened a slim leather folder, and retrieved her phone. She glanced at the moderator. With your permission, I'd like to play a recording. Asterisk, there was a pause. A few raised eyebrows. The moderator nodded, perhaps cautiously. Asterisk, go ahead, he said. Asterisk, Jasmine tapped the screen and held the phone up to the mic. What came next changed the temperature in the room almost instantly. Asterisk, it wasn't a campaign ad. It wasn't a dramatic monologue. It was a recording, calm, conversational, and deeply unsettling. A male voice spoke first. She's easy to trigger. If we press her hard enough during the hearing, she'll pop off again. That clip will be gold. A second voice replied, laughing under his breath. Exactly. It'll bury the rest of the discussion. If she loses it, that becomes what the committee failed to do. Asterisk, gasps rose quietly around the auditorium. It wasn't just the content, it was the cold calculation behind it. This wasn't about debate or disagreement. It was strategy, intentionally provoking a reaction to make someone appear unstable. Asterisk, Jasmine let the clip finish, then pressed pause. Asterisk, I wasn't supposed to hear that, she said, but I did, and I held on to it not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to choose the right moment. A moment where we're talking openly about leadership, fairness, and expectations. Asterisk, she turned slightly to face Ivanka again, in confrontation, but with calm composure. Asterisk, I don't yell because I'm weak. I yell because sometimes it's the only way people listen, especially when they're trying to silence you by design. If that makes me unfit in your eyes, I accept that. But at least now you and everyone else know that it's not always as simple as it looks on screen. Asterisk, Ivanka didn't interrupt. She sat quietly, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. It was clear she hadn't expected this. Few had. Crockett finished her thought with a simple, powerful statement. I can take criticism. What I won't accept is being judged by a standard built to break people like me. The moment Jasmine Crockett played the recording, everything shifted. What had begun as a pointed critique from Ivanka Trump transformed into something far deeper. An unmasking of the political theater that often plays out behind closed doors. The voices in the audio were calm, almost casual, but the message was unmistakable. Jasmine wasn't reacting irrationally by chance. She was being provoked deliberately, set up, used as a distraction. And now, the country had just heard proof of it. Asterisk, the implications sank in slowly. Those weren't the voices of fringe operatives or anonymous trolls. From the tone, the timing, and the context, it was clear that they belonged to insiders, likely congressional staffers or political consultants. Discussing strategy in the wake of a contentious hearing, they weren't debating policy or ethics. They were mapping out a behavioral trap. Asterisk, she's reactive. One of the voices said again in the clip. That's good. If we prod her during the hearing, she'll explode again. Let the press run wild with it. It distracts from the committees. Failure? Another voice chimed in. Exactly. Paint her as unstable. She'll do the work for us if we press her buttons. Asterisk, there was a chuckle in the background, faint, but audible. The kind of laugh you'd hear between two people who believed no one was watching. Asterisk, and that's what made it so disturbing. The language was clinical, tactical. These weren't people passionately arguing their side of a debate. They were orchestrating a moment to sabotage someone's credibility, banking on the public's inability to see past the surface. Asterisk, for many in the audience, it was a sobering moment. Political tensions were nothing new, but what this revealed wasn't just opposition, it was manipulation. The calculated effort to engineer a public meltdown for the sake of headlines. Asterisk, and Jasmine Crockett knew exactly what it meant. Asterisk, she didn't gloat after the recording played. She didn't say I told you so. She just let it linger. The silence did more than applause ever could. Asterisk, I've been called loud, emotional, combative, she said quietly, but the truth is, I've been reacting to something a lot of people don't see. Something designed, deliberate. Asterisk, she glanced around the room. That recording didn't surprise me. What surprises me is how often people assume my reactions are just about ego or anger, when sometimes they're about survival. Asterisk, she then turned her gaze back to Ivanka Trump. When you called me unfit earlier, I understood where you were coming from. You're not the only one who said it. But I think we need to ask what happens when people are being pushed to the edge, not by accident, but on purpose. What happens when the goal isn't to debate ideas, but to get someone to crack on camera? Ivanka remained composed, but the weight of what had just been played was impossible to ignore. She had come to the forum to speak about standards, about the importance of civility and control. And yet, here was undeniable proof that Jasmine Crockett's so-called lack of control had been, at least in part, a manufactured product amplified by those who understood how perception works in politics. The audience was visibly shaken. Phones buzzed as reporters scrambled to confirm the authenticity of the recording. Some looked at Jasmine with newfound respect. Others looked unsettled, unsure how to process what they'd just heard. But Jasmine wasn't done. "I'm not asking for sympathy," she said. "I'm asking for awareness. Because if we allow this kind of manipulation to go unchecked, we're not just hurting individuals, we're damaging the entire institution." That sentiment landed hard. For years, political discourse had grown more performative, more reactive, more theatrical. But what the recording revealed wasn't just about Crockett, it was about the machinery behind the chaos. A glimpse into the quiet rooms where strategy meets cynicism. And though Ivanka hadn't been part of that recording, her comments had inadvertently played into the very narrative those voices wanted to build. That realization wasn't lost on her. For the first time that morning, she looked less sure of her position. Not defensive, just quiet, reflective. The conversation about Jasmine's fitness for leadership was no longer about tone or temperament. It was now about truth. Who controls the narrative, who benefits from the distortion, and who has the courage to expose it when the cameras are rolling. As the final seconds of the recording faded into silence, the atmosphere in the room was transformed. What began as a discussion on decorum and leadership had taken a sharp turn into something far more uncomfortable and revealing. Ivanka Trump, who had spoken only moments earlier about the importance of composure and criticized Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's behavior as unfit, now found herself facing a new reality, one she hadn't expected, and one that could not be ignored. The impact of the recording wasn't just in its content, but in its delivery. Jasmine hadn't shouted. She hadn't accused Ivanka personally. She hadn't even demanded an apology. She had simply offered a glimpse behind the curtain, one that revealed how public perception can be manipulated, and how certain voices in the political system rely on provocation and image distortion to discredit those who challenge them. The room was still. No one dared to speak too quickly. Some of the journalists looked down at their notes, unsure of how to phrase the moment for their evening reports. Others exchanged glances that said more than words could. This wasn't the kind of viral moment built for social media soundbites. It was deeper. It was the kind of moment that made people reassess what they thought they knew. Ivanka Trump sat quietly, her posture composed but clearly altered from her earlier confidence. She looked toward Jasmine, not with the dismissiveness one might expect after being publicly challenged, but with something closer to thoughtfulness. For someone who had always prided herself on staying calm and collected, even in the face of political chaos, Ivanka now found herself confronted with a question. She hadn't prepared to answer what if the behavior she criticized wasn't a flaw, but a response to a system designed to provoke. "I want to be clear," Jasmine said, breaking the silence. "This isn't about me playing victim. I don't want sympathy, and I don't need validation, but I do want honesty. Because if we're going to talk about fitness to lead, then we also have to talk about fairness and how that leadership is judged." There was no applause. Not yet. The room was still too stunned for that. What Jasmine had done was more powerful than sparking cheers. She had pulled back the curtain on something most people sensed but rarely saw proven in such an undeniable way. Ivanka finally spoke, her voice softer than before. "I didn't know about that recording," she said, almost more to herself than the audience, "and I can see how that changes, a lot." To her credit, she didn't try to defend her earlier remarks. She didn't try to pivot or dilute what had just happened. There was a weight in her voice that made it clear she understood the gravity of the moment. She had built her public image around calm logic, around being measured and precise. And now, she was facing a reality where that very perspective might have missed something essential. Context. The moment resonated beyond the room. As clips of the exchange made their way online, the narrative began to shift. Where earlier coverage had focused on Ivanka's criticism of Crockett's behavior, the conversation now turned to the deeper issue Jasmine had exposed: how public figures, particularly women of color, are sometimes cast as unstable or unfit, not because they lack discipline, but because they are being deliberately provoked into reactions that can be exploited. Commentators across the spectrum began to weigh in. Some acknowledged, perhaps reluctantly, that the recording cast a new light on recent outbursts. Others, even those critical of Crockett's politics, admitted that the voices in the clip were chilling in their intent. For Jasmine, the shift was personal, but also symbolic. She had endured public scrutiny for her passionate style. She had been caricatured in media soundbites and cable news panels. But now, with a single piece of audio, she had forced a national conversation about what leadership really looks like. how it's too often judged by those who never face the same pressure. As for Ivanka, she didn't walk back everything she'd said. She still held to the importance of professionalism and grace in public office, but something had clearly changed. The way she looked at Jasmine now was different, not as someone beneath the standard of leadership, but as someone whose experience had revealed blind spots in her own view. The audience didn't erupt in applause. There was no standing ovation, but there was something else: quiet, heavy respect. And sometimes, that silence speaks louder than any cheer. As the forum drew to a close, there was a noticeable shift in tone, not just on stage, but throughout the entire room. The typical political posturing and rehearsed talking points had given way to something far more authentic. No one expected the morning's discussion to lead to a moment that would challenge assumptions and reshape the dynamic between two very different public figures. But that's exactly what had happened. Jasmine Crockett had come into the room. With the weight of public scrutiny on her shoulders, she had been called unfit in front of a national audience by a prominent figure like Ivanka Trump, someone who carried not just influence but a reputation for being calm and calculated. The expectation was that Crockett would respond in kind, perhaps with fire, perhaps with deflection, but instead, she responded with truth. And that truth, delivered through a single, devastating recording, turned the entire conversation upside down. Ivanka Trump didn't double down. She didn't retreat into defensiveness. And perhaps that, more than anything, marked the moment as different. She listened. She considered. She acknowledged that what she had just heard required her to rethink what she thought she knew. In a world where most public exchanges are reduced to winners and losers, here was something more rare to people who, in very different ways, revealed something real. What Jasmine exposed was not just about her, it was about the broader system: how easily someone's image can be manipulated, how outrage can be manufactured, and how leadership is too often judged without context. Her calm decision to share that recording wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a statement about control. Control over her own narrative. Control over how the public sees not just her, but others like her who are often dismissed as too emotional, too aggressive, too much. And what Ivanka showed in that moment of silence after the audio played was equally powerful. She allowed the truth to land. She didn't fight it. That restraint, that humility, even in the face of her own words being quietly dismantled, spoke volumes. As the lights dimmed and people began to gather their things, there was a sense that something important had just occurred. Not a scandal, not a clash, but a revelation. One that would follow both women long after the camera stopped rolling. Because in the end, this wasn't just a story about a recording, or about a disagreement between two public figures. It was about what happens when the truth interrupts the script, when someone refuses to perform the role they've been cast in, and when another has the courage to listen. In politics, moments like that are rare. But when they happen,